Hi, Van. I see people all
hmm
join at once. Um, so I'm very happy to welcome Julian Kölbel, who is, well, actually, Julian, you can introduce yourself and your position. But what I will say about Julian is that he and his colleagues at Zurich and MIT, and now he's at St. Gallen, have been doing some of the most interesting work that I've seen being done by any academic on the topics of investor contribution, impact investing, ESG, impact portfolio construction, and so, with that, I will get out of the way and let him share some of his great research with you. Over to you, Julian.
Super. Well, thank you so much for organizing this interesting call. And I'm, of course, super curious who is in the audience. Hopefully, I will get to know that a little bit as you perhaps ask questions. Um,
Actually, that's a great point, Julian. If everybody could just type your organization name into the chat, that way, because that way you can get to know one another, and also Julian will know who's in the room too.
yeah, fantastic idea. Great. So I prepared a presentation for you, and let me share that. There we go. So I hope you can see that. Good, thumbs up. Why not just let me briefly arrange my windows in a good way. Okay, there we go. So thoughts. I know the title is Do Investors Care About Impact? And I will get to that, but I try to make it a bit broader, titling it Thoughts on Impact, because what I'm going to do is present three papers that I think are kind of linked and very relevant to this overall topic. Just very briefly about myself. So I'm an economist and environmental scientist. I do research on the real world impact of sustainable investing and on ESG ratings. My current roles are I'm assistant professor at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. I'm also affiliated with MIT Sloan through the Aggregate Confusion Project. And I am member of an investment committee at the Abendroth Pension Fund. That's a 2.5 billion pension in Switzerland and probably one of the most sustainable ones, I will say. So I have a bit of a foot in the water of actually deciding where to invest money. Yeah, I think that's about all you need to know. The program will be this. So I'll talk about, these are all papers, and I'm give sort of the pretty quick practitioner focused summary of them. But so one is, Can Sustainable Investing Save the World? The second is, Do Investors Care About Impact? And the third one is Sustainable Investing a Dangerous Placebo? As you can tell, my paper titles tend to be questions, and we will try to answer them in the paper. Okay, so that's going to be the program. If you have any questions, clarification, something you find very interesting and want to know more about, feel free to interrupt. Just unmute and talk. I think that's the easiest way to do it. And you're welcome to do that at any time. Right. So let me start with this one. So this is work with Florian Heb, who is also at MIT Sloan now. And that was already sort of 4 years ago, when we started observing this, this big drive. So it was the beginning of the hype towards ESG and sustainable investing. And we sort of were starting to ask, well, what good does it do? All that excitement around the issue, does anything really change? And we basically answered that by doing a literature review and putting all the evidence that we could find in a bit of a framework. So I'm mostly going to talk about the framework. I think what we realized is that the drivers of why sustainable investing became a thing are actually quite diverse. And I think it's one of the key sort of mistakes that many people make when they come to this space new, that they think it's just all about the same thing. We think there are these three things. There's performance. So, there's the idea ESG will help you perform better. There is something around values. So It's just, I don't want to profit from coal mining, even though if I think it's maybe profitable, it's just something I don't want no part of. And the third one is more this impact motivation, which is really, I want to use my investment, my retirement savings to drive some sort of change. The percentages you see here are from a survey that was done with retail investors in Germany. I don't claim that this is representative at all, but what I do think is the case that all these three motivations are around in different markets, in different fractions perhaps, but they're all important. So we focused on this impact segment, which we felt was, from our point of view, very important in this sort of general debate, academic and otherwise, around sustainable investing. These are the two outcomes. So we did an academic paper, and then we also wrote this guide, which we felt is we felt that's something important that people should have access to. So that's both available. I'll give you a bit the quick summary of the guide. So we developed three key concepts. We say, well, impact really is a cause and effect relationship. It's sort of the change in the real world that is caused by your activities. And this is independent of investing or anything. That's sort of a general way to think about impact. So you have some sort of target parameter that you want to change. Here on the left, it's, for example, the number of people with access to drinking water, right? That's one of the, akin to the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 6. So that number evolves over time, because cities grow and so forth, right? So lots of things happen. Now you do something like you start a program around boreholes, and then you observe what is afterwards the number of people in that village, let's say. And the important thing is always to say, well, because of what I did, that's how many it is now, opposed to what would be the case if I hadn't done it. And that's a bit of a wraparound, but I think that is the thing, right? That's what you want to know. Just saying, oh, the number of people with access went up without thinking, what would have otherwise been the case is not good enough. Sometimes the number goes down, even though the program has been effective, just it would have gone down even more. So I think that's the first thing to understand. And that's why it is so hard to measure impact, actually. The only way is really to infer or estimate impact. So we'll never get a measurement of that. That's my stance. The second key concept is then, in the context of investing, that causal chain just becomes a little longer. And that's very related to the great work that Mike has been doing, about, I think it's called company impact and then investor contribution. We chose a wording that's a bit different, but essentially it's the same idea. We call it investor impact. Let me start by company impact. So that's the change in the world caused by company activities. They make better products, for example, or they improve their production processes. That leads to real outcomes in terms of less emissions, better products, and so forth. All kinds of things, very diverse. But that's what the company is doing. As an investor, you're one step removed. You can potentially influence what the impact that the company has. So we think of it as investor impact being the change in company impact caused by your investment activities. And then there are two essential ways how you can go about that. The one is basically make small green companies larger, and the other is make brown companies greener, no matter the size. Okay, so these are pretty fundamentally different. So grow green companies, you'd want to start with a company that before you start already has a net positive impact. So taking everything together, more of that company must be a good thing. So you got to be convinced of that. And then what investors can bring to the table is financing for growth. So you might unlock growth opportunities, accelerate the growth. Typically the case where there are some financial constraints, so small and young companies, immature financial markets, and companies with intangible assets. They all need help from investors. The other way is for example, by voting and engagement. So you can take companies that are perhaps on balance have a ton of bad impacts, but they can be reduced. And so that's where voting and engagement is a very important tool, often by only helping companies to prioritize which of the 37 things they could do they're in a best position to actually tackle. So that's the other channel. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the sort of the key building blocks of what we develop in that guide. So that's how we think about it. What we provide in addition, that I'm not going to go into detail here, is some sort of an overview of the evidence we have for different mechanisms to achieve either of those two directions. And we think voting and engagement and both also conduct-based screening. So if you have screens that apply, that are very clear practices that you can either implement or not, rather than industry screens, right? Because a company can never get out of its industry. They can't grow out of their skin, but they can, every oil company can do something better. So that's the thinking we have here. I think overall, we think that is restricted to incremental change. So I think I just caution people to think that sustainable investing will lead to the great green transition. I think for that, a lot of other things need to be in place, primarily some sort of regulation around externalities. Nonetheless, I think there remain a lot of low-hanging fruits to be picked all around the world. And as investors, you're often global. And if all companies really adopted best practices and were really strategic about, what the best possible impact is they could have, I think there's still a lot to be gained. Okay, so that was topic number one. And I realize I'm going at an insane pace here. So feel free to interrupt me. The second paper is now, so we kind of established this framework, what is impact? And we were left wondering a little bit that there weren't a ton of products out there that sort of, put into practice what we had thought of. And one reason we thought that might be the case is this question here: do investors really care about impact? And to what extent do they? So that's a paper that's been published in a very good finance journal, and despite the sort of niche, start that we had, it became editor's choice. So people in the community really liked it, and I think it has some really interesting learnings in practice as well. The motivation is, so we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and there is a lot of money that's classified as sustainable. But what's decisive is sort of not just the size of the pot of money, but also the impact that every dollar in there has. And so what you need for that is probably some scrutiny from the people who put money in the pot, and sort of, what are we getting in terms of a deal for impact for our money, right? How attentive are they? So in a nutshell, the research question was, does it matter for investors' willingness to pay how sustainable an investment is? So if the idea, if for $1 you get 1 tree planted, will you pay 10 for 10? Right, that would sort of normally, that's how you normally think about a price, a unit price, and how much you pay for more. So we wanted to know whether that's the case with impact as well. So the design that we came up with, this is an experiment. So basically, we let participants choose between two funds. The one is a regular fund, doesn't save any CO2 emissions. And the other fund, we say, this, if you invest here, it's going to save a certain amount of carbon emissions. So that's, if you will, T1, the high impact group. They get funds A and B, 0 tons versus 5 tons. In the other group, it's the low impact group. They get the same setup, but here they get 0 tons versus half a ton. So, a factor of 10 less in terms of impact that they can have if they choose the fund B. So we let people decide, and then we do some survey afterwards. But the decisive thing is, they decide, and then we say, okay, fine, you prefer that fund. You still want it if we raise the fee by 50 basis points. And then if they still say yes, okay, how about, it's like an auction basically. So we ratchet up the price until they say, okay, now I'm out. It's too expensive. So that's how we want to figure out, what's the maximum they're willing to pay for that choice that they initially made. So this is how that, just to give you an illustration that you can better imagine this. If you were to participate in the experiment, you would have gotten this screen. So you have this fund A and fund B. It's both a US large cap. They're pretty similar in terms of past returns and risk. Just there's this fund on the left side here, saves 500 kilograms of CO2. And then we thought, nobody knows what 500 kilograms of CO2 look like. So let's translate that. So we say, okay, that's 3 trees or 1,500 airplane kilometers. And by the way, we did this. So the study was run in Europe. I'll come to it. So we use kilometers. I know miles might be more appropriate for Americans. And then, or the CO2 emissions caused by an EU citizen in 25 days. So to give people a feel for how much is that in sort of practical units, right? And then we let them decide and play this sort of auction game that I just highlighted. So the result, I'm getting to the result. So you might ask, so who did you ask? We did this with a number of samples, but the main one was a sample of private investors. So these were found through, this is an investor protection association in the Netherlands. So these are all people who have investments, who have experience with investing. So they're not random people from the street, you might say. They're all sort of experienced but private investors. So they're not professionals neither, but they know a little bit about investing. And they don't have any specific sustainability focus. Here you see some descriptives of those guys. But that was important to us, that there were real investors, and there's also money at stake. So we say that for 10 of the people who participate in the experiment, and you're investing 1,000 euros. So for 10 of them, we actually implement the investment, and they get the full 1,000 euros plus the return, positive or negative as that may be, after 1 year. So that's just, to avoid people telling us some random stuff in the survey, but to know, well, there's a chance I'll actually make a gain on that. So maybe I should pay attention. So the result was that people don't make much of a difference. So this is the willingness to pay for 1,000 euro investments. And on the left graph, you see, the absolute value of that. And you see 41 versus 48 euros. And that's a little bit different, but it's not significantly different. So you would say, well, there isn't really a difference. Plus also, if you look at the impact per unit, if you think back of the trees and the dollar bills I showed you in the beginning, so if you calculate what they're paying per ton of CO2, then in these two groups, the willingness to pay is vastly different, right? You may ask, 41 euros for 1,000, that's a fee of 4%. That's perhaps a bit much. Completely agree. We think that's driven by the fact that it's an experiment, but it's high in both groups. So, what we're really after is this sensitivity. So it's at a high level, but at that high level, they're not sensitive. We did, just to reassure you, it's not in the slides, we did a bunch of replications with online participants in the US, where we, for example, gave them information. Oh, by the way, the usual fee for an ETF is 10 basis points. If you do that, you get lower values, but this insensitivity was very, very robust. People just don't respond to that information. So maybe they just don't get it. Well, we have some back up to say, they really looked at the information. So the green circles, this is a bit of a convoluted slide, but the green circles tell you, if they remember which fund they chose after the experiment, and also the exact level of impact that the fund had that they were able to choose. So the vast majority remembers exactly what information we gave them. So it's not that they just forgot about it. Also, the graph on the right-hand side here, we did the same game, but here we didn't give impact information. We gave information about past financial return, and also varied that by a factor of 10. So the one fund, so baseline was 5%, and one fund had, the opposite at 5.5. In the other group, it was 5% against 10%. What do we see? Almost exactly a factor of 10 in the willingness to pay. So people linearly react to that sort of information. And I think that's reassuring that, they got the experiment and all that. It's just, in the case of this impact information, they don't respond that way. So why? Okay. So how do I say this quickly? So I'll start with, I'll do 2 and 3. So 2 is maybe people aren't really able to evaluate what that means, and not in the sense of, these are 3 trees, but in order to, come up with a price for that number. I mean, what's the price of 3 trees or 1,500 airplane kilometers saved? And that's also, it's hard to come up with a good price for that. So maybe it's not that they don't care, but they just don't know how to approach it. So for that, we did an experiment with experienced impact investors that we thought, on balance, if you deal more with these type of investors, you should get better at that. It's something you can learn. And the other explanation we came up with is that people don't act as consequentialists here. So they don't care, like they're not utilitarians who care just about the outcome. It's more, they want to do the right thing, and they sort of have an emotional benefit of doing the right thing, whatever that may be. Okay. So on the investors with expertise, so these impact investors, that was a cool feature of the paper. I think we were able to recruit 100 people who had undergone training and, sort of a 3-day impact investing training, who had done impact investments themselves. So they're not perfect, but they should know better, a little anyways, than the average Dutch investor. They're also, what's also unique about them, this is a high net worth, ultra high net worth sample. So, they also have the cash to be creative with their investments without worrying too much. And they are exactly the same. They're even worse, if you will. So here you see the comparison between the private investors that we had first and the impact investors. So they have, on balance, a slightly higher willingness to pay, maybe not surprising, and it's exactly equal among the 2 groups. So they also don't really react. And that leaves us with this, we did one more thing. So we said, okay, maybe if you just have, if you can compare things side by side. So instead of just having fund A and fund B, we say, okay, we give you fund A, B, and C, and you see 0 tons, half a ton, 5 tons. What happens here is that people do make a difference between, this is the 0.05 ton, 0.5 ton, sort of a low range, and this is a higher range. So here, yes, there is a difference. Okay, it's way off of a factor of 10, because note, I mean, this is still between 0.05, excuse me, and 0.5 is still a factor of 10 difference in what you get for the impact. And that's the only difference between these 2 funds. Otherwise, they're the same. So it's pretty muted, but there is a little bit of an effect. So if you compare things side by side, people react a little bit. We did a detailed analysis to look at individuals, and we find there's sort of a fraction of about 15% or 10% of people. They are like rational as you would expect. So they are willing to pay exactly 10 times more for the 10 times more fund, but they're a minority. They exist, but the majority, sort of in the middle, they're ones that do kind of what you see here, like they say, it's a little bit better, I'll pay a little bit more. And then there's a group that just, is flat. They pay exactly the same. So if you want to think of, yes, there is some client segmentation, if you will, but there's a small group who are acting like hyper rational, and the rest does something else. And then the final thing is that we looked at kind of in a regression where the willingness to pay at the individual level is the outcome. So how much does every individual pay? We looked at what drives that. And we have positive emotions. So, people report that. We ask them, how did it feel to invest in that fund? And you can say, well, on a scale from 1 to 7, it felt really great, or somehow medium. And the other is the estimated cost of saving a ton of CO2. So their own internal price, right? And you would think if people think about this in terms of, a consequentialist, okay, what am I getting? What do I think is it, what's the worth of saving a ton of carbon? And you should probably scale that by whatever you get here to arrive at a rough number, what you want to pay. But that doesn't really drive people's willingness to pay. What really drives it is how good you feel about it, the positive emotions. You see stars here, right? Stars means that's really driving the relationship. And the treatment, of course, but that's obvious, right? Because depending on which group they are, they pay something different. I'm sorry, I should mention that this is the willingness to pay per ton of CO2. Sorry, right, to understand that. That's why the treatment has a strong effect. That was I'm sorry, I should have explained it better. If we just to clarify, here on the right-hand side, you see the willingness to pay per ton. And there we have a huge difference between the treatments. That's what shows up in this regression again. But in addition, the positive emotion. So people who felt good about it, they paid a lot more than people who sort of just felt a little bit good about this.
Maybe one question from my side, if okay.
Yes, of course.
I guess CO2 reduction is a very particular kind of impact, right? Environmental, you would have a lot of other sort of impacts on the health and well-being side, for instance, on the nature side. Do you have any hypothesis on how the willingness to pay for impact differs based on the type of impact, and maybe also the previous experience of the investor, and thereby the emotion related to that kind of impact?
I do, but it's a hypothesis. But I think that CO2 emissions was our best shot at getting a behavior that's sensitive to the amount. I mean, you could do the same thing with polar bears or accidents in factories. But I think CO2, it's something. I think the average participants is, that's something that's in the media. It's a lot. It is quantifiable at least, right? So there's a protocol how you measure that. I think it's only going to be more problematic with other types of impact. It's my hypothesis. It would be worthwhile testing that, but that's what I believe. Your point about how do people feel, right? So I think that matters a lot. So if these are things that people feel very, very strongly about, then there will be a high willingness to pay for anything that sort of satisfies that expectation that you'll do something good in that thing that you care very strongly about. There's super interesting research that shows that emotional categories are basically binary, fundamental. So either you love it or you don't. So if you give these binary choices, emotionally you make up your mind, okay, that's the better one, I want to have it. And the pricing is then just depending on how much you love it.
Very interesting, thanks. I guess generally my question, also our question, is always like, what is impact actually? And you do have the CO2 reduction component, which some argue is ESG, essentially. Others would call it impact.
Oh,
and
yeah,
then
thank
there's
you for that question. Or that comment. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you're done, but I think I know
yeah,
where
no, just I guess
Yeah.
it's a maybe another very interesting research field of what impact actually comprises, because it's such a fluid term, let's say.
So I couldn't agree more that, if you have a portfolio footprint that's, highly questionable if you should sell that as an impact, that sort of violates what I presented in the first part. In here, this was not a portfolio footprint. It was, we actually just bundled the investment with a sort of super high quality CO2 compensation project where we really are convinced that this is additional. So we didn't cheat people here on the impact side. But out there in the real world, I completely agree. CO2 footprints, handprints, you see everything, and there's a lot of a debate what does really count as an impact. Very good point. But let me actually, just conclude and say what I think the sort of practical takeaways are. So I think what we see is that investors have a substantial willingness to pay for sustainable investments or impact investments, or however you label that, just for the better thing, right? But this level of impact, either just the scaling of it, but also this more qualitative point is lost on most retail investors. Even with experience, it doesn't get a lot better. So I think even, investing in literacy and education, I'm not sure if that's really the solution. Comparability does a big difference. So if you compare things by side, people start to, respond, but it's very strongly affected by the choice set. So whatever choices you give people, like, between two really terrible impact investments, but one's a bit better, or between two really fantastic ones, they just get that they're different. They don't know where on that scale they are. And emotions are eventually the driver. So a consistent explanation is this willingness to pay is driven by positive emotions about having impact, not impact itself. And I think the conclusion is the investors really actually care about impact, but they are not consequentialists. They're rather sort of warm glow optimizers. They optimize how great they feel about this. And I don't mean this in a bad way at all. I think, this is just human behavior. And from my perspective, the point is, how do we make the most out of that nice human behavior, right? People want to do the right thing. They're even paying for it. So I think now it's important to help them to do something useful with that impetus. And there, I think we go to the implications. So I particularly want to highlight the second point. So asset managers, knowing this, they have a real incentive to optimize their offering for warm glow and not for impact. So if they know customers will pay for that good feeling, probably the most profitable way to go about this is to say, okay, here's our standard offering. Here's the green option. And it's just a teeny weeny little bit greener than the standard option. So, it's low costs, but still you can benefit from the whole willingness to pay fees. And your customers will not be sort of critical on that. Even worse, if you sort of say, okay, let's go the extra mile, let's offer something really ambitious that really has a lot of impact, and we'll invest in that, and we have costs, well, people are not going to pay you more than your competitor's product, because they see that as the same potentially. So I think there's a real risk that asset managers exploit that. The solution, I think, are two things. So I think labels are really something that we need, because individuals act out of emotion. They use heuristics. So you have to feed these heuristics with something that's very easy to understand, but underneath has a lot of thinking, and a lot of solid evidence for, what should be called a sustainable or impact investing product. it's very interesting. There's in different jurisdictions, there's all this thinking going on, you know, what should be allowed to be a sustainable investment or an impact investment. And so I think that is extremely important because it is going to drive how people decide to quite a strong extent. The other option is to state impacts in monetary units. I think that would be the ideal solution. So if you, because people are good in comparing money with money. If I tell them, you know, you get climate benefits worth $10, then yeah, you pay around $10 for that. So that's easy. There are other experiments, they implemented it in the way that, you know, as the sort of your impact would be a donation to an NGO that then has some sort of impact. People responded to that as you might expect, right? If the donation is $10, and you pay $10 more. Of course, it takes out the interesting and the hard part, which is, you know, what does that NGO do with the money and how much is the impact really? But if, you know, if there is a way to state impacts in monetary units, which is super hard to do, but I think then also people would, you know, come back to this usual microeconomic framework that we expect. Shoo, okay, let me pause here just for a second if there's more questions, more maybe on the implications of that. Yes, I think there is one. Sorry, yes, somebody's hand is up. Sila, yeah.
Hi, Julian. Thank you so much for the presentation. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while. It was great to hear your work from first hand. So I have one comment and a question about the experiment. The comment regarding the stating impacts in monetary units, I think it also talks to the Isabella's comment on like, this is CO2 is only one metric, and there are very different types of metrics that would not be always possible to sum up and then divide to monetary units. So this is a challenge that we are seeing in the practitioner side, which might be challenging to come up with a per dollar impact metric that can be used across the funds. The question I have is about the experiment's design. The actual emission data you provided there, like in that experiment, was that a single year historic emission data or a forecasted emission data? And do you think would that result in different choices at the investor's side?
Maybe if I may answer this second part first. So no, I don't think that this would result in different choices, whether it's the previous year or the next year or what the denominator of that number is, given that people don't even, you know, react to the main quantity, whatever it is. What it was specifically is what, you know, this was a 1-year investment, and we weren't specific around how that impact is going to work. We just realized it on the back end of it. We didn't, and the reason for that was that if you start telling people that the portfolios are different, they start thinking about the performance implications of that, and that, you know, that sort of creates noise. We later checked that performance and risk expectations were not driving how people decided. So they actually looked at these funds as pretty much equivalent, financially speaking. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, there are 2 more questions. Very nice to meet you all. Yeah. I think next up is that Sarah. Yes. Oh, sorry. I think you are muted. I don't hear you anyways.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you sharing your research. This is very interesting and useful. I'm curious if you had the opportunity to segment the audience by age or by gender, and if that made any difference, because I think I'm not surprised to see these findings, but I'm curious whether there's a shifting in the perspective of the cohorts by age, because they may have been more exposure to ways of discerning the importance of impact, or a greater importance placed on impact.
Thank you, Sarah. I also saw you also wrote something in the chat, so I'll take both of these things maybe. That's the same Sarah, right? So these kind of gender or age, yes, we have the data. I think there is a bit of a difference in terms of that young women are a bit more interested in impact in general. So their willingness to pay is higher. We see that, and that's consistent, I think, with some other studies out there. They are not, however, more kind of critical when it comes to evaluating the impact deal they get. So in that sense, they're all the same, I would say. But there is a heightened interest. Also, this impact investor sample was substantially younger and a lot more women in there. And remember, as I showed you, it was a bit higher, but nonetheless, it was pretty much the same. You also had this. No, I'll get there.
So in your
the chat
spoken
moved,
remarks,
so I was reading something else. Please, yes, just go for it. Yeah.
Just to clarify, in your spoken remarks, I think I heard you say that many offerers should optimize for warm glow, not for impact. And
No. I think that's what they do.
And your notes there on the page do say something slightly different than that, which is an important distinction. So I just wanted to respond to that, because I'm assuming many people will sort of take what you've found to be guidance about how to conduct themselves, and I think we should be mindful of that.
I think what I'm saying is good you bring this up. This is crucial. I'm not recommending that. I think what I'm concerned about, that this is an equilibrium outcome, right? So given how asset managers are incentivized and how clients respond, this is what they might do. And honestly, if I look out there in the asset management world and what is being offered, sometimes I get this feeling that every bank, they have their green option on the side, and then if you're a green investor, sure, you get the green option, because they know that most customers, they're not going to sort of do a big comparison around what their options are and how much impact they could have elsewhere. And labels, and I think to some extent these globe ratings or other labeling schemes, they're tackling that. So I think they're very important, so that you have this comparability. Okay. Wow, the hands are going up. So let me move down the list here. David, you had a question, I think.
I was going to say, what if we got all the questions at once, and then you could just sort of pick a few themes to respond to?
Okay, we can do that as well.
Yeah, because I also want to make sure that you still have a third paper. You're like,
I still have a third paper I want to get to. That's right.
Yeah. So why don't we get all the questions on the table, then you can maybe respond as a group, and then we can move on to the third paper.
Okay. So who wants to start? David?
Hi, Paul? Julian. Appreciate the design, a beautiful design of this experiment. So there was the one question I put in the chat, which is, you say they optimize for warm glow, and I just wonder if people why do you say that rather than satisfice for warm glow? So that was just one question. And the other question is more about kind of interested in the subgroup analysis. You say there is a cohort that is actually sort of consequentialist and sort of rational in that way. And I wonder if that, I was wondering whether actually there are distinct groups within that impact investing group, and whether or not that reflects just how people in society think. Is it just that actually there are different types of people in terms of how they think?
Good. Thank you. I noted that. We'll have the other question as suggested by Mike. Paul, where did Paul go? Paul had a question.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, and just dealt with the compensation side. Is it possible that down the road, when you're looking at compiling information, that one of the questions could be asked about the compensation structure? Because my thinking is that if there's no investment organization, you really want to get impact investing going, maybe that's something that's added into maybe the bonus structure for a manager. I mean, it could come up with unintended consequences, but at least, place start. That could be something to think about. So just want to throw that out there.
Thank you. And Anthony,
Oh, hi, Julian. My comment and question is about marketing. So, if you think of impact capital managers, they spend a lot of time marketing and miseducating their LPs that they don't have to pay for impact. It's their basic marketing strategy. Studies like yours and the research tradition you cite suggest that that's not true. Traditional managers spend a lot of time miseducating their investors that their returns are higher than they actually are, if you look carefully at their track record over a longer time horizon, and that the risks are lower than they actually are. And so there's kind of the built-in mismarketing, miseducation of the investor base by the financial product folks. It's true in the private markets and the public markets. In your case, then, I'm curious what your recommendation would be, say, to the impact capital manager type. Would it be to kind of switch your marketing around? So maybe now you need to educate your investor that they should care about the relative scope or magnitude of the impacts? Or, I'm just curious how you think this would reframe the marketing budget of these impact capital managers.
Right. Thanks for the questions. I'm going to go through them backwards, just, for ease of keeping that all in working memory. On the miseducation point, I think, so that's certainly the case. I think what I see as a sort of solution is really labeling, and sort of a good label, I think, a bad label is terrible, but a good label could do a ton of good, in the sense that it would, basically the idea I have is that let's take that, there's a certain part of the population who wants to pay something for impact, and they have this, emotional attachment to that. So I don't want to let that go to waste, right? You can let that go to waste and just use it all to generate fees for the financial industry and have zero impact. That would be the bad outcome. And I think the good outcome is to sort of, use that emotional attachment and willingness to pay to really channel cash and funds into, genuinely helpful products. And for that, you need to make that distinction very easy. And sort of a good labeling scheme would, people could still miseducate, but they couldn't put their products in that box where they wanted to be to offer that kind of emotional satisfaction, right? So there must be a bar to clear to sort of get in that box. And then, if you can then still outperform, fine. But so I think that would be my answer to that. Paul, on the compensation structure, I think you could, compensate your PMs for impact, but I think the key driver is fee revenue and assets under management, right? So it's going to be very hard to solve that issue, with an incentive scheme that isn't tied to sort of really the success of the fund. So I think it's going to be hard as a solution for that problem. That's what I think, anyways. But thanks for bringing it up. David, cohorts, there's this cohort. I don't know who these people are. I'm not sure if I'm part of that cohort. I find myself being, taking these shortcuts, making decisions. We have the whole sample is very sensitive to financial information. So it's not that, these are the smart people. I don't know who these people are. I mean, there seem to be people who sort of stop and think and become very kind of type 2 in Kahneman speak, but most people don't. That's all I can say, I think. And why we don't call it satisficing, you're completely spot on. Satisficing is also sort of a model to explain that, and we're not super detailed in what is the detailed psychological model behind that. We can basically say, well, it's not consequential. Just to respond to that. Wow, this is a great seminar, great question. So I have another 10 minutes that I want to give you a tour of the third paper, which I also think is really interesting. So here we ask, is sustainable finance a dangerous placebo? And we take up a criticism that was very prominently launched by Tarek Fancy, and you can see him here on TV, and what he's been saying for a while is that he says, well, ESG investing, he thinks it's dangerous because not only is it ineffective, like doesn't have any impact in his view, but also, and that's what makes the placebo dangerous, it distracts from sort of the things that are really moving the needle, such as, finally implementing some sort of CO2 tax. And I think it's an interesting hypothesis. I thought it was a really interesting hypothesis, and it's been nagging me because it might be true. So we wanted to put that to the test. And we had a great opportunity here in Switzerland, where I live, where we voted on a CO2 law last June. And as you know, Switzerland has a direct democracy, so people actually get to vote on this concrete law. It's a single issue on one Sunday, right? You go to the polls and you vote. And it was contentious. So you see here the two campaigns, they're in German, but I translated. So it was the classic, the pro-climate. They say, okay, this is protecting what's important to us. The contra campaign, oh, you want to exacerbate the energy crisis. No to the electricity eater law. That's a literal translation. So here the design was the following, that we said, okay, this is great. We have this referendum coming up. Let sort of simulate two worlds, one with, one without sustainable investing prior to the referendum. So in the investment stage, the treatment group, they had a choice again between these two funds, a regular global ETF and a climate Paris-aligned ETF, both real products that MSCI offers as we presented them. And we chose it in such a way that the climate fund, if you looked at the past performance, it looked a little worse. And then in the control group, they get the exact same two funds, but here we just don't show the climate information. So you don't see it's a climate fund, you just see the financial information and you see, well, the one is a bit worse than the other. So the idea is that the people in the treatment group, they had the opportunity to satisfy their preference for protecting the climate by taking that investment decision. And now our question was whether that will erode their political engagement for that upcoming referendum. And the way we implemented that is through a donation. So again, the experiment was incentivized. And we sort of, after you've took your investment decision, we say, okay, now you can, deduct something from your payout that you will get eventually and donate it to either the pro or the contra campaign, like whichever you want. That was 5 weeks before the actual vote. So it was still a time where that donation might actually, have an effect, right? Because they put posters up and do social media and stuff like that. And then we have a survey stage where we do a bunch of other things, but that's the main thing. And we're just going to show you a little bit how the funds look like. So you see the purple and blue line. So, I mean, they are very similar, but the climate fund is a bit worse than the other. You see that on the right-hand side. And the climate information is here, relating to that point before, we actually use the CO2 footprint. And we use this expected global warming potential. And these are figures that just we take from the product. So that's something that people might see in the market or do see. And it's again incentivized in a pretty similar way as we did the other experiment. So the result is first that we have a strong change in preference through the treatment. So in the control group, roughly 30% pick the worse fund. And then in the treatment group, 76% or 77, I think, they pick that climate fund. So that I think that's for us mainly, it's kind of, we suppose that would happen based on the prior paper, right? You will see that it's kind of similar. So, but we were glad to see, because that kind of means, well, the treatment actually worked. So people noticed that there is something. And then on the outcome variables, what we see is no significant difference. On balance, people are slightly more pro the referendum if they were in the treatment group. And we see that in 3 different outcomes. We see it in the net pro campaign donation. So we scaled donations against the law negatively, for the law positively, and they come out positively, the treatment group is a little bit higher, but it's not a significant difference. But we can pretty clearly reject that hypothesis that having the opportunity to invest in a climate fund sort of lets off the steam that people may have, and then they, just say, well, I've just invested in a climate fund, I'm not going to also donate to that campaign. No, people seem to be consistent in their choices here. And we see the same with just which campaign they chose, and also we asked them, of course, how they intended to vote, and that all comes out pretty much the same. The law has been passed eventually, and these figures we have here for voting intention are extremely close to official survey polls at the time. So I think we kind of nailed that. Also, there are a number of questions that might pop up, so let me head them off right away. So maybe a framing effect that people just think more about the climate if they see that climate fund. But we don't think it's very salient because I showed you the campaign. So these billboards, they were everywhere in Switzerland at that time. So it's not that they were unaware of the law and the vote. So we think framing is limited. It's kind of on the margin, right? Everybody is aware of that already, and they are a little bit aware more. We don't think that's a strong effect. The other thing, that's another very interesting hypothesis, that once people are positioned with their money in the sort of, if you will, the green economy, then they might also be in favor of regulation that benefits that green economy. We explicitly try to sort of shut down that channel by the fact that this is a global ETF. So whatever happens in Switzerland is not going to, have any meaningful effect on a global ETF. And the reason why we did that is that it's incentivized, of course, but the regulation will affect your real assets, not just what's in the experiment. So we want to sort of keep it clean on that mental trade-off channel here. Okay, I think I'm at the end of the hour and also at the end of my talk. So that last one is a working paper. We're still working on it, but I thought it's a nice addition to the other paper, because I think it really, so I was worried about this critique, and now I'm, much less worried, and it really sort of gives a cover. I think it remains important to be critical on impact products and what really causes impact. But it continues to be legitimate to think about that. We don't have to worry that the whole enterprise is counterproductive. So I like that. And so in that sense, I think it's an important paper for this, for all the thinkers around impact. Yeah, I'm happy to stay a bit on for more questions, but I think we're at the top of the hour, so I'm also not insulted if people need to leave. I put here a few links, and maybe I can share the presentation later via you, Mike. If you want to follow, I also have a podcast where I like to discuss these kinds of ideas that might be of interest. Thank you so much.
Julian, I just